In the holy name of Jesus, we begin our sharing on Joshua chapter 2.
那奉主耶稣圣名开始我们的这个查经分享，我们一起来参看约书亚记22章。
We know in life that misunderstandings are something that has and will continue to be a problem with mankind.
那我们知道，在我们生命当中呢，有时候和人之间的这种误会呢，是会来到去就是把这个问题来到去就是变成更加复杂。
And it was a problem with the nation of Israel too.
那这种误会的这种事件呢，也是发生在这个以色列百姓当中。
And in this chapter, we learn that even after God had steered Joshua and the nation of Israel to great victories,
那我们发现说，虽然是说神已经带领约书亚还有他的其他的百姓来到去得着这个就是得业之地之后，
and often against overwhelming odds and formidable enemies,
他们就是来到去胜过许多的这些仇敌。
But even after all these battles, they found themselves towards the end in a situation that almost led to civil war breaking out amongst them.
那虽然是说他们发生了这么多这些就是得胜的事，那在最终我们发现他们却引起了自己的一种内乱几乎要打起来。
And at the center of this danger of civil war was simply because of an assumption and a simple misunderstanding.
那为何他们会发生这些内乱呢？是因为就是这个出于这个误会还有一些就是一些个人的一些断定或者是认为。
So we learn how this misunderstanding occurred.
那我们就是从中可以学习到这些误会是如何来发生的。
Who was involved and why this came about?
那到底谁牵涉在内然后就是之后就是发生了什么事
But above all, we learn that by all sincerity and honest pursuit of the truth, how this understanding was eventually resolved.
那就是他们最终是用这个真诚的心还有和解的心最终把这个误会化解了。
And it was resolved with a happy and a peaceful outcome.
那他们是就是把这个误会化解了，然后最终大家都能够来到去重新得着这种平安和这种喜乐。
So there is much we can learn from this chapter about tolerance towards one another.
所以从这一章呢，我们可以来去学习如何来到去彼此忍让，来到彼此妥协。
And based on our ability to listen carefully and avoid being hasty to judge.
那我们要来到去仔细聆听在我们去断定或者是判决或是论断一些事情之前
and condemn jumping in too early without all the facts.
那好，让我们就不会来去定别人的罪，在我们还没有看清楚这个事情之前。
In other words, drawing conclusions based on assumption rather than the facts.
那就是来到去避免，就是按着个人的这个意见或者是一种认为来到去定一个人的罪，而不是按着真理来到去判决。
So the chapter starts with the armies from the tribes east of the Jordan.
在这边呢，我们可以看到这个河东支派的这些以色列的这些士兵。
And these were the Reubenites, Gadites, and half of the tribe of Manasseh.
那他们都是这些吕遍、迦得人，还有这个玛拿西半支派的人。
And these are finally sent home after 7 years of battle.
那他们在7年之后就是终于可以得以回归到自己的这个得业之地。
And they are ordered back by Joshua to join the remaining 9.5 tribes that are settled to the west of the Jordan River.
Sorry.
They are ordered to be sent back to join the remaining 9.5 tribes settled to the west of the Jordan River.
Send back. Sorry. You mean I did return back?
They are sent back from the east of the Jordan back to the west of the Jordan to join the remaining tribes.
那么就是从这个这个约旦河东就是回到去这个约旦河西。
And in the first 4 verses, Joshua thanks them for a job well done.
那他们在第1到第4节这边呢，就是约书亚呢，就是来到去来到去称赞他们，因为他们就是把他们的工作来做好了。
They had been helping the tribes to conquer their enemies, and they had been completely obedient and helpful to Joshua.
那他们是帮助了其他这个就是9个半支派的人来到去征战并且得胜了所以现在这个摩西是来到去要打发他们回到自己的支派。
So once they had achieved victory, and the land was conquered, then they were asked to go back and join their families.
那他们已经是把整个就是全地都就是完全的得着了，所以呢，现在他们就是要回到自己的这个原本的这个所属他们地方去。
But before they leave and return, Joshua in verses 5 and 6, Joshua gives them an exhortation and a blessing.
那在第5、第6节，我们可以看到，在他们被打发回到自己的所属之地之前呢，约书亚呢是来到去送行，并且来到祝福他们。
And it is quite significant what Joshua says to them in chapter 5 and chapter 6. In verse 6.
就是这个约书亚对他们所说的话其实是就是蛮有意义的。
We read verse 5.
那我们来看第5节。
But take careful heed to do the commandments and the law, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul.
第5节，只要切切的谨慎遵行耶和华仆人摩西所吩咐你们的诫命律法，爱耶和华你们的神，行他一切的道，守他的诫命，专靠他，尽心尽性的来侍奉他。
Now here Joshua emphasized that they must do and keep his commandments.
那约书亚在这里吩咐他们呢，他们要来切切谨慎的来去遵行，并且去遵守神的诫命。
Now, this appears at first reading to be a repeat.
那当我们就是一开始来去读这个章节时，看起来他们是重复性的。
But in fact, there is a difference between to do and to keep.
那可是对于这个遵行和遵守是有分别的。
So here Joshua is reminding them to both be fully aware of God's commandments,
那因为
practice them with diligence and care.
那因为约书亚就来到去告诉他们要来切切谨慎不但要去遵守神的诫命，要来去把神的诫命遵行出来。
And this is just the same as the encouragement Jesus gave in John chapter 14, verse 15, where Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commandments."
那就像如同这个耶稣他就是给他门徒的命令这记载在约翰福音书14章15节。那如果你们爱我，就要去遵守我的命令。
So, but in verse 6, Joshua also gives them a blessing.
那在这个约书亚记22章6节，在这里我们可以看到约书亚呢来为他们祝福。
And this blessing has been passed down by God through Moses and Aaron.
那这个祝福呢，是从神来到去就是传给摩西就是来传到给这个约书亚。现在约书亚把这祝福来到去就是发去给这个就是送出去给他们这个两个半支派的人。
We turn briefly to Numbers chapter 6 and we read verses 22 to 26.
那我们来看这个民数记6章。
Numbers chapter 6 verses 22 to 26.
民数记6章22至26节。
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, verse 23, Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the way you shall bless the children of Israel. Say to them, verse 24, The Lord bless you and keep you. 25, The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. 26,
26节
Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
22节，耶和华晓谕摩西说：“你要告诉亚伦和他儿子说，你们要这样为以色列人祝福说。”24节，愿耶和华赐福给你，保护你。25节，愿耶和华使他的脸光照你，赐恩给你。26节，愿耶和华向你扬脸，赐你平安。
So Joshua is reinforcing to the two and a half tribes after their long 7-year battles.
那所以就是在经过7年的这个征战之久那他们一起并肩作战，所以他现在就把这个祝福来到去来到去祝福他们。
And although they are glorious and no doubt relieved to return to their families, that they must not forget the commandments of God and the blessings that God has bestowed upon them.
那虽然现在这个战争已经停止了那他们可以光荣的回去，那他们也不应该来忘记神的诫命。
Now, as we move on through verses 7 to 9, we learn that the armies of the 2.5 tribes depart with much spoil, possessions from their victories.
那我们读到7到9节的时候呢，我们发现呢他们就是要回到去这个他们自己所属的这个帐篷去，那他们从这个仇敌夺来的物呢是非常多的。
So they are being rewarded for their obedience to God.
那他们是因着他们对神的顺服，他们得着这一些赏赐。
And this obedience to God is manifest through the faithfulness to their fellow brethren.
那所谓对神的这种顺服呢，他们是就是显在这个对于同灵之间的这一种帮助和这一种忠诚。
And God has allowed them to gain much of the plunder that they can take back home with them, the possessions they can take back home with them.
所以神就允许他们让他们能够把这些掳掠的这些物件都带回去。
Now, of course, as Christians today, we believe that when we obey God, we will be gainers, not losers.
那今天同样的，我们相信神的话，相信我们都是这一个受益者而不是这个失败者。
But not all of these gains, of course, will be in an obvious material sense.
当然我们所得到的这一种益处，有时候不会是一种物质的层面。
But our gains are through blessings in so many different ways that so many in the true Jesus Church can testify to.
那可是我们所得到的这一些恩惠这些祝福呢就是在真耶稣教会，我相信我们都可以在许多人身上可以听得到这种见证。
So they are returning after 7 years of separation from their families.
那他们这2个半支派就是离开家人已经有7年了，那现在他们终于可以和家人来团聚。
And I just ponder for a moment of what was in the minds of their families and the other members of the 9.5 tribes.
那可能我们在想，在另外这个9个半支派他们这些家人会想什么呢？
Are they in good physical and mental shape after this endurance of warfare?
那他们就是在这一个征战的当中，这7年之久，他们这种就是心灵上到底是否能够忍耐得住呢？
Have they kept their faith strong? Have they remained loyal and obedient to God?
那他们是否来有保持他们的就是持守着他们的信心就是还有他们对神的这一种信心呢？
Without any obvious means of communication, what condition are they in mentally and physically?
那到底他们在这个肉身上还有属灵上的这个状况是怎么样的呢？
So really, they can only look from a distance for any signs or signals of what their current state of mind and condition would be.
那他们只能够就是来到去向这个远处来去盼望就是他们这个在为得着胜利之前的这种就是要保守这样的一种心态来去盼望。
So this brings us to really the main focus of this chapter from verse 10 onwards.
那这个也会把我们带到去这一章的重点，就是从10节开始。
We learn in verse 10 that the 2.5 tribesmen do something quite extraordinary.
那在10节这边，我们可以看到这2个半支派呢，他们就到了这个靠近约旦河的地方，做了一些事情。
They take it upon themselves to build a huge and impressive altar.
那他们呢，就来到筑了一座非常高大的坛。
And so they did this before crossing over the Jordan.
那他们是在就是靠近约旦河的一带来到去建筑这一座坛。
And this was very significant, not only because of its size, but because of the meaning of an altar.
那就是这座坛呢，是不仅是高大而已，最重要的就是这个坛的意义背后的意义。
An altar was a place of sacrifice, and both the Israelites and pagans had altars that they used for sacrifice.
那因为一般呢，这个坛呢，对于这个以色列百姓或者是这些外邦族，他们也是会用坛来去做献祭给他们的神。
So what was going on here? Why had they chosen to build this huge altar? Were they worshipping pagans?
那在这里，他们到底做了什么事情呢？那为何他们要来去筑一座这么高大的坛？那到底他们是筑这座坛来去祭拜这个外邦神吗？
We turn briefly to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12.
我们来看这个申命记12章。
Deuteronomy chapter 12, and we read verses 12 to 14.
我们来参看申命记12章12至14节。
Verse 12, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion nor inheritance with you. Verse 13,
13节。
Heed to yourself that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see. Verse 14.
14节。
A place which the Lord chooses in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you.
12节，你们的儿女仆婢，并住在你们城里无分无业的利未人，都要在耶和华你们神面前欢乐。13，你们要谨慎，不可在他所看重的各处献燔祭。14，唯独耶和华从你们那一支派中所选择的地方，你就要在那里献燔祭，行一切我所吩咐你的。
So the members of the 9.5 tribes are wondering, what's going on here?
所以这另外9个半支派呢，他们就感到就是重重疑云，就在想到底他们建这个坛来做什么呢？
For we have the altar and the tabernacle of meeting set up in Shiloh.
因为他们已经是建造了神的这个帐幕就在这个示罗之地。
And we know that the law of Moses establishes that for the Israelites that there can only be one altar in one tabernacle of meeting.
因为按照这个摩西律法，神给他们的这个命令，就是他们只能够在一支派所选择这个地方来到去向神献祭而已。
And that this tabernacle of meeting and the altar is only looked after by the Levites.
那这个神的坛还有这个神的帐幕呢只是被这个只能被这个利未人来看管。
And we learned this last week when we were studying Joshua 21 and from previous chapters.
那我们在上周再来去查考那个约书亚记21章的时候，还有在之前的一些这些约书亚的这些章节，我们都学习得到有关这一件事情。
Therefore, the building of this huge separate altar would have clearly raised eyebrows amongst the rest of the Israelites from the remaining tribes.
所以当这个2个半支派呢，在这约旦河另起一座这个坛的时候呢，就是会令另外的9个半支派呢感到非常的疑惑，就是为何他们要这样做呢？
So we learn from verses 11 and 12 in Joshua chapter 22.
那我们这个约书亚记22章11到12节这边说。
That the news of the building of this great second altar reached the 9.5 tribes west of the Jordan River.
那在这边这个全会众的人都打听到有关这件事情，那就是说在这个约旦河西的这些9个半支派听说了他们来到去这2个半支派来到去特别做一座坛。
So once they received this news, what was their reaction?
所以当他们听到这个消息的时候，他们的反应是怎么样的呢？
And we learn in these verses 11 and 12.
那在11和12节这里说
That when the news comes to the rest of the tribesmen, there was no discussion, but a simple reaction.
那他们一听见，他们其实是没有来去做任何的讨论，他们只有就是一个动作而已。
They immediately gathered to make war against their own brothers who built this altar.
他们就聚集在一起，要来上去攻打这些筑坛的人。
Now, we must recognize here that Joshua played no part in this reaction.
那么发现说，其实约书亚并不在内。
Joshua did not order them to gather.
那就是说，约书亚并没有吩咐他们积聚在一起。
They gathered of their own accord. It was an automatic reaction.
那他们就是自动自发的来到去积聚在一起就是并没有得到任何的命令或者约书亚的吩咐。
And as we learn later in the chapter, that they were probably maybe because of the many battles that they'd all fought, that they were probably in truth a bit quick to take action against their brothers.
那可能就是他们因为都经历了那么久的这些战争的日子，可能他们的在一些思绪上、行为上，可能就会比较的就是比较的灵活，就是直接的来去做出这种反应。
But also their readiness to fight this battle also shows great courage to confront on behalf of God's truth and holiness.
那他们就是拥有这样的一种反应来到要上前去寻找他们就是这个攻打的这种准备要去为神攻打，是因为来去显出神的圣洁。
This was a healthy, God-fearing body of people who were able to purge itself from poisons and heresies.
那这些就是敬畏神的人，是因为他们是不愿意这些不好的事情来到去侵犯神的这些条例或者是神的典章。
Even having said that, it will emerge that they were probably a little too quick to take up arms and a little too rash in their attempt to defend God.
可是却看起来他们就是有一点就是冲动来到去行这件事情。
But actually, we then move on to verses 13 to 15.
那我们继续13至15节。
And we see a calming and controlling influence being introduced.
那我们这边可以看到，就是这些人渐渐他们的心态被缓和下来。
Before they rush into action towards their brothers in the 2.5 tribes.
那在之前呢，他们是非常的冲动来行事要就是急速下去来去实行这个攻打的计划。
We find that Phinehas, the high priest, and representatives from each tribe west of the Jordan personally confronts the leaders of the 2.5 tribes.
那在这边我们可以看到这个祭司这个以利亚撒的儿子菲尼哈，他们就是来到一同下去见这两个半支派的人。
And we learn here that Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, led the group because he had the authority to do so.
那么发现这以利亚撒的儿子菲尼哈这位祭司呢他是带领这些首领10个首领一同去找这两个支派的人，因为他是有这样的一种权柄。
He was the high priest over the whole nation, including the 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan.
那因为他是这个全国上下的这个祭司，包括这在约旦河东的这两个支派，他也是他们的祭司。
But we learn that Phinehas is not only the authority from God, he also has the heart of a wise shepherd.
那我们发现这个菲尼哈祭司，他不仅是拥有神的权柄，他也是有从神来的这一种判断能力。
His initial thoughts were that he wanted to go and correct them from what appeared to be them making a big mistake.
那就是因为他的心是想要来去看到底他们做了些什么事情。
And he suspected that there may be some dangerous individuals amongst the 2.5 tribes, and that he wanted to drive those people out.
所以他可能就是产生一种怀疑的心，就是怀疑这两个半支派可能当中有一些人他们就是离开了就是神的这些真理所以他要到去那边来去查看然后把这些人呢驱赶出去。
But you can see God's love at work here.
那我们可以在这里可以看到神的爱和神的工作。
because rather than being quick to anger and war, Phineas was prepared to confront them and learn more of the situation at hand.
那就是因为我们可以看到以其他们直接下去攻打，可是在这边我们可以看到这个菲尼哈呢，他是用这个爱心还有就是在事情就是来到去查清楚这件事情才来去去判决他们，所以他是用的这个对质的方式来去询问。
So as we move on through verses 16 to 18,
我们来看16到至18节。
We learn that Phineas now brings the accusations against the members in the 2.5 tribes.
那在这边，菲尼哈呢，就是与这个2个半支派的人来对质。
He asks them, "What treachery is this?"
所以就问他，就是你们为何要这样悖逆神呢？
You know, he was suggesting to them that they had built a rival place of sacrifice and worship.
那因为他们是这样做的话就是干犯神，那为自己来到筑一座坛。
And we know that the only place of worship for the whole of the 12 tribes was in Shiloh.
那因为全部人都知道就是这个敬拜神的地方应该是在示罗。
So what was going on?
到底你们为何这样做呢？
Now the danger here was that if they had found that they were setting up an alternative place of worship, then the priest would have no where to go but to cut them off from the rest of the other tribes.
那这个祭司是打算在对峙之后，如果发现说他们是真的是就是按着自己的这个意念来到去筑坛的话，那样的话他们就会来到去判决他们，把他们驱逐出去。
We turn to the book of Leviticus chapter 17.
我们来看这个利未记
And we read verse
17章
9.
9节。
Leviticus chapter 17 verses 8 and 9.
利未记17章就是8至9节。
Verse 8. Also,
8
you
节
say to them, whatever man of the house of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among you, who offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice, 9, and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from among his people.
8节，你要晓谕他们说，凡以色列人家中的人，或是寄居在他们中间的外人，献燔祭或是平安祭酒，若不带到会幕门口献给耶和华，那人必从民间剪除。
So we understand from this part of the chapter that they cannot worship God any way they choose, any way they please.
那从这个章节告诉我们呢，他们不能随心所欲的来到去在别处来到去敬拜神。
They can only worship and make their sacrifice in the one true tabernacle of meeting. In other words, one true church.
那他们只能够在他们独一所选择好的这个会幕门口来到去献祭给神，也就是独一的真教会。
So there must be they must respect God in the spirit, and they must worship him in spirit and truth.
所以他们应该就是用这个诚心来到去敬拜神就是用诚实和真理来敬拜神。
Just as it says in John chapter 4 verse 24.
那就这是记载在这个约翰福音4章24节。
John chapter 4, verse 24.
约翰福音4章24节。
God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth.
那24节，神是个灵，所以拜他的必须用心灵和诚实拜他。
Now, Phinehas reminds the eastern tribes that Israel has been punished before for rebellion against God.
那在菲尼哈祭司呢，就来到去提醒他们说有关之前他们如何被神来去处罚的事情。
And he says to them, "Is the iniquity of PR not enough for us?"
那就是他有提到，就是从前他们来到去拜这个比尔的罪孽。
Now, this was an incident that was recorded in the book of Numbers, chapter 25, verses 1 to 3.
那这是记载在这一个申命记25章1至3节。
We turn to the book of Numbers, chapter 25, verses 1 to 3.
我们来一起参看民数记25章1至3节。
Now, Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. Verse 2. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. Verse 3. So Israel joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel.
1节，以色列人住在省亭，百姓与摩亚女子行了淫乱。2，因为这女子叫百姓来一同给他们的神献祭，百姓就吃了他们的祭物，跪拜他们的神。3，以色列人和巴利比尔联合，耶和华的怒气就向以色列人发作。
Now, Phinehas was fully aware that the Israelites had been down this road of perdition and sin.
那菲尼哈非常清楚知道，在过去他们是就是犯了这一些罪行。
And we know if we read the whole of Numbers chapter 5 that the people of Israel at that time had been killed. 24,000 of them had been killed by a plague.
那我们知道，也因为这事件呢，我们在读下去的时候可以看到，神就用瘟疫来去击杀以色列百姓。当时有24000人死去。
And this incident was especially meaningful to Phinehas the priest.
那这个事件呢，对菲尼哈来说呢，是很有意义的。
Because he was the one who stopped the plague by making a dramatic stand for righteousness in the midst of gross sin going on around him.
因为菲尼哈呢，在当下呢，就因为仗着神的公义，来采取了这一个行动，来到去对付了他们的这些罪恶。
So Phinehas was very fearful that this 2.5 tribes were straying into sin and idolatry, just as had happened in the past.
那也因为菲尼哈这样做，这个瘟疫才被止住了。所以菲尼哈很担心现在他们这个2个半支派呢，又会再做出一些得罪神的事。
So as we read on through verse 19.
那我们在读这个19节的时候
that there was a willingness on the part of Phinehas to make a sacrifice to keep the brothers from sinning.
那我们回到约书亚记22章19节，在这边就是我们可以看到菲尼哈他是愿意来做出一些牺牲，好让他的弟兄们能够脱离这些罪恶。
And he was showing love to them by inviting them, even if they were unclean, to return to the tribes on the western side of the Jordan.
那就告诉他们说，如果你们所得为业之地，你们嫌是不洁净的话，那你们可以过到耶和华之地，来到我们中间得地业。
He pleaded with them. he said, "Do not rebel against the Lord, nor rebel against us by building yourselves an altar."
所以他是来祈求他们用爱心的来去告诉他们，你们只是千万不可来到去悖逆耶和华，也不可得罪我们，在耶和华我们神的坛以外为自己筑坛。
And Phineas was so concerned and so worried that even in chapter 20, he reminds them of a further example of the price the Israelites paid for sin.
那就是菲尼哈是非常的就是看重他们，那并且就是用了第二个例子来去提醒他们曾经在以色列当中所发生的这些罪恶。
And he records the sin of Achan and its effect on all of Israel.
那他就提醒他们有关这一个亚干所干的事。那亚干所干的事就是神的愤怒，令神的愤怒临到全会众。
And his emphasis here is that the sin of just one or two members can reflect on all of the members.
那就是就是一个人的罪会牵连到其他的人。
But from verse 21 onwards,
那21节，我们回到21节。
We see here, we witness a turning point in the fortunes of the 2.5 tribes in the eastern lands of the Jordan.
那在21节呢，这边我们可以看到这2个半支派的这个转捩点。
Because of Phineas's love towards them and giving them an opportunity to, as it were, give their version of events.
那就是因为这个菲尼哈他是以爱心来到去就是来去对质他们。
They started off by saying that it appears that there has been a mistake here.
所以在22节呢这边我们可以看到这2个半支派呢是如何来去回应说他们是误解了。
We feel that we have been misunderstood in the purpose and the meaning we have for building this huge altar.
就是说你们是误解了我们为何要来去筑这座坛的这个后面的意义。
So they began to explain to Phineas the purpose of building this altar.
所以他们这2个半支派就开始向这个菲尼哈来到去解释为何他们要来筑这座坛。
And we learn this from verses 24 to 29.
那在24至29节，这里我们可以看到他们的解释。
Here, the eastern tribes explain their true reason for building the altar.
那在这边，他们就来去解释他们真正要来去筑这一座坛的这个缘由在哪里。
And what they were essentially saying was that they had built this altar as a memorial, as a replica, not as a place of sacrifice.
那他们只是要他们来去就是做这个坛，是在他和他的后人中间来做证据而不是要来去筑另外一个坛来去献燔祭。
And that this would, they built it so large that it could be seen on both sides of the Jordan for the east and the west.
那因为他们这个坛是非常的高大，甚至这个约旦河东和河西的人都能够看到。
And their view was to unify everyone in a common purpose to worship God.
那他们只是要借着这个坛来到去一同敬拜这独一的真神。
And then we learned in verses 30 and 31.
那我们再看这个，接下来看30至31节。
That through the grace of God, the explanation of the eastern tribesmen was eventually accepted by the western tribesmen.
那我们可以看到这个约旦河西的这个9个半支派，还有菲尼哈都认为这件事是美好的。
Because it says, now when Phinehas the priest heard the words, it pleased them.
那这个他们听到他们的解释，都以为美。
So Phinehas here must take a great deal of credit.
那所以在这件事情上呢，菲尼哈他是扮了很重要的一个角色。
Because he was able, in effect, to put himself into their shoes, to understand their rationale for building this altar.
因为他们是设身处在他们这个2个半支派的这个立场来去看这件事情，为何他们要来筑这一座坛。
Phinehas could see that the Lord was amongst them.
然后菲尼哈可以看见主是与他们同在的。
And because of the eastern tribesmen, their willingness also to listen to Phinehas.
那也是因为这个约旦河东的这些2个半支派，他们是愿意来到去顺服，来聆听菲尼哈的这个教训。
And also for them, from the eastern tribesmen, to put themselves into the western tribesmen's shoes.
也是让这个约旦河西的这个9个半支派的人，也要来站在这约旦河东2个半支派的这个立场，来去设身去为他们去想，为何他们需要这一座坛。
And this is that there was actually no disunity between them. It was just purely a misunderstanding based on an assumption.
所以他们是带着这个合而为一的心来去思想这件事情来去设身去看这件事情。那最终他们就把他们的这个误解就是这个误会化解了。
So we find in the epilogue in verses 32 and 34.
那我们接下来看32至34节。
That in the end, the differences, there were no differences, but each side had the opportunity to explain to one another to reach unity.
那其实是他们可以看到约旦河东河西的这些支派，他们其实并没有有这个差异的心态，他们都是秉着同样的一个想法。
And this fulfills the passage in Psalm 133, chapter 1.
那我们能够来到去参看有关就是这个诗篇113篇1节。
Psalm 133, verse 1.
133篇1节。
Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity.
1节，看弟兄和睦同居，是何等的善，何等的美。
So, this situation, this confrontational situation was resolved in the end peacefully because both sides had the will, the love, and the fear of God in them.
那最后这个误解就化解了。那因为他们是就是秉着这个神的这个爱心，还有合而为一的心来到去让他们重新来到去和好。
So we learned that we mustn't jump to conclusions.
所以我们学习到，我们不应该来太急速的做下决定。
We must always listen carefully before we speak.
那就是我们在说话之前，我们应该要先来学习，先聆听清楚。
In Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13, it says, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him."
Sir, Proverbs chapter
18:13.
我们来看这个箴言书18章13节。OK。13节，未曾听完先回答的，便是他的愚昧和羞辱。
Yeah. So we must always respond to others with a concern for God's holiness in our heart.
所以我们应该要就是用按着神的这个圣洁来到去切切的来去学习如何来到去回应他人。
We must always try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes.
那我们也要来去常常学习如何来站在别人的角度去看一件事情。
And like Phineas, don't try to confront someone unless you are willing to help them.
那就像菲尼哈一样，我们不应该来到去与别人产生这种对峙，除非你的这个心意是要来去帮助他们。
Always respond to a matter with reconciliation in your mind rather than to fight first.
那我们也是要按着这种与别人和好的心来到去回应或者是来去就是处理一些事情。
And so my sharing ends here. Amen.
那我的分享到此结束。阿们。